What we're going to talk about here is sending data into a function and returning data from a function here. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to quickly make a couple of functions and show you how to send data into a function and then how that data is returned from a function as well. Okay, so we're going to make a function here, and I'm going to call this I'm going to call this add2, and I'm going to make this a return type of int. So we're going to expect that it returns an integer back, and I'm going to say that this is going to be called add2. Okay. So this function is going to be called add2, and I know that it's going to I know that it's going to return an integer. So I'm going to go ahead and leave that return statement down here and just get everything ready. Okay. So add2, I'm going to say that I'm going to need to pass into this function here. I'm going to need to pass into this function a number so that I can go ahead and use it. And I'm going to see in that from the user. Let's say num, and let's give num existence here. Okay, I'm going to tell the user enter a num, and I will add 2 to the number. All right, so overall design of this here: create a number, I get that number from the user, and I'm going to send that number into this function, add 2 to that number, and then return it back so that I can use it. So I'm going to show you really quickly how that works and how we need to be careful with this data sending and returning, and how to expect that data to be handled. So anytime that data is sent in there, and the reason why you have to send the data in here is because, look at this real quick. I'm going to prototype this function so that I don't throw the error on this here. If you're not familiar with function prototype and some reason you're watching the videos or lectures out of order, go back and watch function prototyping. It will answer why I'm doing this here. Okay. And I'm going to add a parameter to this here, an argument, and I will have to change my prototype to match this list here. And I'm going to give that to this function in a minute. But let me show you real quick. I'm going to reference num. Okay. Now, I'm not going to do anything with it, but I'm just going to put num there. Notice how it lights up here, and it says num is undefined, and that's because there's this iron wall that exists between the functions. Okay, and the reason why this iron wall exists between the functions is that functions, the body of the functions, the scope is limited to this body here. And the reason why it's limited to this body here is because it's the rules of the game here with functions. Okay, there are ways to reference variables from other functions and get past the iron wall, but this method that we're going to be using, we cannot reference a variable that belongs inside of another function here. It's kind of like residence of a country here. Okay, there's that iron wall that's here, and unless we go through due process of getting that into, so to speak, through customs here, we can't actually use and reference that variable. Okay, so now I'm going to go back to adding an argument for this function here, and this is the way that we go through due process. We send that data into the function. So we actually have to create a new variable, and kind of think of this as like catching that data that's being sent. Okay, so I'm going to be sending an int, so I need to have an int ready to catch that value that's going to be passed in here. And I'm going to call this x. Okay, so now that I have x, I can then catch that data x here. And I'm going to see out x just to show you that I got it. wait, let's say num value is just to show you that I'm not lying to you and that it is actually coming into the function and being passed. Okay, so now I need to make sure that I also update my prototype. Right, it's changed, so we need to make sure that that's updated. We don't want another error. Okay, num value is, and it's going to print this out. Okay, so now let's call this function here. Okay, to call the function, we simply are going to call it by its identifier here, add to, and then we're going to pass it num. Num is the integer that we're wanting to be copied into that function. Okay, so we're going to pass it num. There it is. So this num here is going to be copied into x. And x is a variable that's been declared to catch the value here, to copy that value down. It's not actually sending and referencing the num that's up here. Okay, then it's going to after we copy this down here, we're going to then add the functionality to add 2 to that number, then return it. Okay, now just where we're at here, I'm going to go ahead and build this and show we have a build error here, and the build error is saying that we have to return a value. So see how we have this return statement where we're not actually returning a value? Well, we have to return that value. So we have to return something. We said that we were going to return an integer. We actually have to return an integer. We can't just return nothing. So let's go ahead and return x. Okay, let's go ahead and build again. We have entered a num, and I will add 2 to the number. And the num value is 2. Okay, and then the function returns back to main. Now, that's all nice, and this is cool that it's working, but if you look at this function and evaluate its functionality here, this is a really worthless function. Okay, it's not really doing anything with x. It's returning it, but then it's just throwing it away. It's not doing anything with it. Furthermore, we don't even have the functionality to add 2 to it. So let's go ahead and do that now. So to do this, what we need to do is we need to have x, and we say x plus equals 2. How about that? That works, right? Okay, cool. So we now have x with 2 added to that number, and now it's being returned. Well, let's go ahead and output this value here. Let's go ahead and let's take away this statement here. Okay, let's come up here, and now that the function returns, let's see out. Well, how do we figure out what this num is? Do we do this? Let's see out num. And if we do this, does that print out num now that has 2 added to it? Let's print this out. Okay, I'm going to add 2, and then we see 2. That's weird. Or is it? What's actually happening here is we're calling this function. The function is then going through the motions, adding 2, returns it back to main here. But then again, we don't see that reflected in this here. And that's because of this reason here. When you call the function, the return turns into the statement itself. Now, if I were to do this, if I were to say num is equal to this function call, now watch this. Do you see that? The return of a function turns into the value. That's what this turns into. This statement turns into, once it returns, is it turns into the value of whatever it is when it returns. So if you were to capture that, okay, if you were to capture that call, you can then get that value. Okay, so whatever value is being returned here, if I was to say just return 5, just for demonstration here, and no matter what I put in here, it's just going to return 5. You see that it returns 5. And 5, here, this function call, 5 is then stored into num. So that's some food for thought there. The thing about returning a value from a function is that you need to have some way to store that if you're expecting this value that comes back from this to be used in some other way around inside of main or inside of another function. So that's something very important to consider when you're building this here. Also, too, whenever you have a return from a function, you can only have one piece of data coming back. Now, that's not to stop you from, say, doing something like this, 4 plus x, and you can wrap it into more complex expressions. But the thing that returns back needs to be evaluated as one piece of data. Okay, one piece of data. So it can't be two things. You can't say return x and return this and return that. It doesn't work that way. So you only get one piece of data coming back that matches the return type. Okay, and you cannot return anything that is not the return type and multiple parts of that. Okay, so there's a section inside of the lecture that kind of talks a little bit more to that as well. So please see that and post if you have any questions on that. But this is here how to get around the issue of arguments and storing that output back from the return statement. Okay, so hopefully this helps with your assignment. Thank you guys for your time.